Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a project update video for this 1/6 scale Armortek radio-controlled Russian T34 85. Since the last video update, the bow MG has been fitted in place, and that thing has also been hooked up so it's functional. And we also have mounted onto the rear deck section the blower cover, which marks the end of the rear deck section of the model, and the rear deck area is now completed. So in this video, there's going to be a bit of info to go after, so stay tuned and just sit back and enjoy. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and kick this one off. Starting this video off takes us to a new component that I mentioned in the previous video, but here I finally have the parts in hand and we can continue with the remainder of the assembly. And this is actually a very crucial bit of component because this was really the last component that needs to be added structure-wise to the vehicle to complete the rear area. And what this is the new ECA 3D printed rear T34 blower cover. Naturally, the kit does supply you with the exact same component that we have here. However, that component is all made out of a solid block of CNC aluminum, which sounds great. However, as what has been seen on several of the other components found on this build, it gives you enough to get off the ground, but it definitely leaves some room for improvement, specifically with detailing. In addition to that, because I went ahead and replaced the entire top deck section, namely on the engine area, with the new ECA 3D printed component, the original aluminum section was just not going to fit properly, and it just wasn't going to work, so a new replacement was going to be necessary. And I went ahead, hit CAD, came up with the components that we see here on the table. So without further ado, let's go ahead and actually dig into it. So the set contains quite a bit of detailed parts. So we have the largest section here, which is the main cover. We have an inner frame. We have two types of hinges, a length of wire, as well as also a little length of mesh. Also, in typical ECA fashion, I tried to go ahead and integrally print as much of the detailing as possible onto the part, so the thing has the most amount of details imaginable, however, with a part count that is very minimalistic compared to the basic necessities that we have here. So starting with the top will take us to the main cover itself. So here you can see the piece, and this is one 3D printing that we have here. The piece has all of the appropriate detailing present. Luckily, I had some very good reference materials online that I was able to use to get the setup that we have here. And when it comes to these sections here, again, when it comes to T34s, depending on the plant or which version of T34 it is, they do differ somewhat. However, the one we see here, I mimicked off of, or I should say, I copied as much as possible off of a real T34 85, specifically the one that is in Aberdeen. And also, I believe I also cross-referenced it with one of the ones in the UK. But either way, here is the final product. So on the real T34 section, the entire section is actually one giant steel stamping. So they twump it into shape, and then they just weld it on the two sides over here on the inside, which you'll see in a second. And that's basically the shape of this section. We have here this half moon cutout. The other components, namely the hinges that we see here, are just welded directly haphazardly onto this section on the bottom. Of course, it's a mirror image on the opposite side. We have some spot weld details that are integrally printed on. And we have another set of hinges that we have here on the top, and these are riveted in place. Note the little cutouts here found on the piece of stamping. What's interesting to point out is that to the common observer, they will think that this large hinge over here is actually how the thing hinges open. But that's actually not the case. These hinges here are not hinges at all. These are actually your locks. The way the thing opens up is actually this way, and the hinge design is fairly unique in that it's extremely Russian, meaning it's super simplistic, but it does the job. And we'll see the corresponding parts for that in a moment. But the other thing to reference is the actual top itself. So this thing is known to have a grill in this section. This protects the louvers on the inside where we have the giant cooling fan for the diesel. And on the T34 family, there's this quite noticeable and distinctive grill section found on the top. Well, the grill section is made up of this frame section that we have here, and this would be welded to the top cover. And then the meshwork is actually fit on the inside, and it's riveted in place with some sort of a washer or inner frame type system. All the details are found on the ECA example, including, again, all the spot welds in their appropriate locations, as well as also the rivet detailing. So once this thing is painted, you're going to have all the appropriate details present, and it's going to look fantastic once a coat of paint gets thrown on it. On the inside portion, we have here those inner welds, because why not? Might as well go ahead and add them. The piece, you'll notice, is all thin with the appropriate thickness here of the steel plate. So it has scale thickness, and it has the nice hollow sections, again, so topped off with the sculpted on weld beads, or sculpted on in the printed on weld beads. We also have here the inner detailing here of the hinges with the reverse rivets found on the opposite side. And this now leads us to the inner frame. So as you can see, we have two frames. We have the outer frame here and the inner frame. The inner frame, again, it's all integrally 3D printed as one piece, and the reason why I have this here is that this is how you're going to actually secure the mesh in place. So the way this set is designed is that you cut the mesh to shape, and then once you fit it into this little recess that we have right here, this fella just snaps in on top of it, sandwiching it into place, thus keeping it where it needs to be. As you can see, the piece just drops directly in. And once the mesh is there and all the glues are set and everything, it should do a good job with keeping the mesh where it has to stay and keep it there in perpetuity. The next thing to reference are the hinges. So I'll start with the faux hinges in a moment, actually right now. So here you can see the sprue. You have enough for one vehicle. Actually, I gave you two extras for a what if type scenario where in case one has a mishap, you have some spares ready to go. The pieces are integrally printed hollow, so they are good to go from the get-go, as are the hinges on the top sections itself. Note, these guys also have their spot weld details present, and these guys would be attached to the rear portion of the hull. So I have a nice little long stem over here. You mark, drill accordingly, and then the piece just gets dropped into place. So, like I stated before, this piece here, it's not used to hinge. This is actually used to pin the thing together. And the way it works is you have this rod that essentially acts like a hinge pin, but it's a little bit longer and more likely has a little handle on the other end. So then when it comes time to service this thing, you grab the pin and you just yank it out, and then once it's removed, the piece is now unhinged in a good way, and you can actually peel the piece open. On the reverse side here, we have the following setup. So here we have this little hinge block that's riveted in place, and we have a corresponding hinge block that is identical to this one here. How is this functional? Well, it's quite simple. This guy here would be riveted to the top deck, and then you would have this wire, no joke, a wire square that's bent to shape, and this would connect to this guy over here as well as this guy over here, and that's it. It's just a big floating hinge, and it just operates in that manner. Like I stated before, extremely haphazard, extremely just minimalistic, but again, welcome to Russian T34s, so that's just how they go. Jumping back to a bit of equipment I mentioned in the previous video, takes us back to the Bow MG ball. In the previous video, I mentioned that this is a new 3D printed component found on the ECA catalog, and that is still, of course, true. I also mentioned in the other video that the unit was designed to be able to pivot either by hand, or if you're going to make the vehicle radio controlled, you could potentially hook it up to a servo and have the piece animated. And that's something I'm going to do on this build. So the ball itself, since the previous video, I went ahead and made some slight alterations to the pieces just to make the parts perform a little bit better. So with the way the piece is fresh from the printer, the tolerances are very tight, which is fine. However, if you're going to try to make the piece function with a servo, you need to open them up slightly just so it loosens up the tolerances and it puts less strain on the servo, and the piece will perform much better. To do this with the use of an X-Acto, I just went over some of the areas that intersect with the ball section of the MG mount so that once the tolerances are slightly opened up, less areas where the thing can grab and hang up. And as you can see, the piece can pivot absolutely freely and very, very effortlessly. From here, I'm going to now hook up the internal systems where it has an arm that can emerge from the ball over here, enter into the tank, where then I could go ahead and hook it up to the servo. So now you know what I'm going to do. Let's see how I go about doing it. Jumping forward a little bit, we take us to the first step. Then that was to get the MG ball thoroughly painted. So obviously the entire unit was primed with flat black. However, in addition to primer, you also need to paint the ball section. And this is true for not just this unit, of course, but any tank vehicle with a MG ball type setup. The same exact rules apply, so pay attention. So after the primer was added, I then went ahead and painted it with the base coat. And why this is relevant is because once this thing is assembled, you're not going to be able to get access to these fine areas over here to get the paint on. And what happens is if you try to paint it after the fact, the layers are going to be built up, and then what'll happen is when the ball gets pivoted, it's just going to scratch right off, or it'll even be a restrictive type thing and it'll prevent the thing from moving, neither of which is ideal. So the best time to do it is before the unit gets installed. I went ahead, suspended it on a piece of wire, and I thoroughly airbrushed the inner areas here with the base coat. The airbrushing is the best way to do it as opposed to doing with a paintbrush, because with the airbrush the paint is very thinned out and it gets applied in a very thin layer, but the opacity is where it needs to be. So this is the best case scenario so that you can add the paint, get the paint in the correct locations, and do so without adding too much in terms of layers and overall dimensions. Once the layers are added, the paint is dried, and then I can go ahead and get the piece ready for assembly. This guy here just slipped right back on. If I just drop this guy in this place over here and pivot this thing around, you will see that the paint is not scratching off at all. This little area over here, this little wear mark, was just from the collar slipping over, but in this area here, this can easily be touched up when I go over the tank again with its final base coat at the end of the build, which is actually coming soon. Either way, that is the best way to ensure that your MG ball is thoroughly painted and weathered. This is a common mistake out there. I've seen a lot of builds in a multitude of different scales from 1/16 to 1/6 where they do this type of procedure or this type of a detail fitting, and next thing you know, you'll see it and you'll have either bare material exposed or you'll just have a primer coat exposed, and again, neither of which are doing you any favors. So bear that in mind. Whatever scale you're working on, if the thing has a pivoting MG like this, be sure to go ahead and paint the piece before installation. As for this guy over here, I'm just going to go ahead and add some drops of super glue strategically, and then I'll be able to fit this guy in place. Obviously, I want to emphasize strategically, because if you add a little bit too much or you put some in the wrong location, the glue is going to get into a spot where it shouldn't go, and then your functional MG ball becomes a static MG ball, and again, it's not exactly doing you any favors. So I'll go ahead and take care of that off camera. Let's go on to the next step. Before I can progress any further with the unit, though, I do need to address the bow MG. This needs to be installed at this time, because once the unit is mounted into the vehicle, you're not going to be able to slip this in from the outside because of the gas system, and it needs to be inserted from the inside, well, just like the real unit. And also, just like I mentioned in the previous video, this one here is the pre-production sample where I went ahead and cut the gas system over here so that it could go up flush against the MG ball. However, after looking further into it, I saw that that wasn't exactly accurate, so I redesigned the ball. The production ones will have this addressed, so you don't have to worry about it. However, for this build here, of course, I'm using this unit, but I am going to have to modify it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and amputate this section here that's abridged, and I'm going to go ahead and secure on this PVC, or I'm sorry, a styrene tube that I have lying around the shop, same diameter as this guy over here. And once he's glued on in place, as you can see, it's going to give the look of the gas system that is more appropriate. As for why I have to go through all this, well, let me quickly go ahead and line this fella up here. There we go. Alright, so see the MG fitted in place. And as you can see, it's just slightly too short for where it needs to be. Again, this is where the ball was continuous, and I had to mill it away for the reasons I mentioned in the other video. But anyway, looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly take care of this now. To do this, I'm going to go ahead and use my Dremel with a small router bit. I can also use a belt sander, or I'm sorry, a bandsaw to go ahead and amputate the section off, but it's easier to just use the Dremel. Alright, I'll just hit that with a needle file over there just to polish it down further. Then once that's done, this guy here can just get installed in place. And here's the tube now fitted in place. This tube is slightly smaller than the other one. Because of the confines on here, it was a bit easier to slide it in with the smaller diameter tube. Either way, the tube was just glued to this section over here. However, for extra strength, I drilled a hole into the middle section, put a piece of wire in place, and then the tube slipped over the wire. Once the glue set, this thing is now rock solid. From this point here, it's going to get painted with its flat black, and then I'll also do some dry brushing onto it. This is something that generally is done at the very tail end of the build, namely installation of MGs. However, because of, again, the location of this thing over here, once it's fitted in place, you're not exactly going to be able to install this once the unit is mounted to the vehicle. So it's at this point here I could go ahead and get everything painted. Also, on that note, in terms of painting, because of how protected it is, it's actually really easy for me to mask this thing up. So that'll definitely also be beneficial in preventing any sort of overspray from hitting the barrel itself. Another reason why I have to fit this in place at this time, besides the reason I just mentioned, is because on this section here of the MG ball is where I'm going to use to fit on the pivoting mechanism, and obviously I can't install the MG if the pivoting mechanism is in place. So again, when it comes to stuff like this, everything has to be done in procedural steps. And here's the front end fully painted and weathered and ready for installation. On the DT front end itself, it was painted my weather in my usual format. If anyone's ever seen my videos before, regardless of scale, it's the exact same format for painting these type of pieces of equipment. The entire thing is painted flat black. Then I go ahead and add the dry brushing effects here for the worn effects. And then, to me, a flat black is airbrushed on certain key locations to simulate the powder fouling. And yes, a piece of equipment like this would definitely have powder fouling, specifically with the ammunition that was used during the time. If anyone's ever shot any surplus Russian ammo, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So, some people out there seem to think that there's Wunder powder back in the 40s that we don't have today. Kind of funny. Anyway, back to this section over here. On a DT, you would have powder fouling effects right here on the muzzle end, and you would also have it right over here where there's the gas system. With the way the system operates, there would be some powder fouling in this section over here after a few rounds. So once that was applied, now at this point here it's ready for installation. For the actual piece itself, of course, it's going to be slid into this area here, and if we notice now, compared to where it looked previously, I went ahead and added some more paint in this area over here, again to better mask this section later on. Because the MG is sticking out, it has to be thoroughly protected to protect it from the layers of base coat which will be applied as the build comes to an end. However, it's better to go ahead and get this section here painted with the base coat, just so when I peel the mask off, there's no missed locations of paint. And then I'll have to go in here, and it runs a risk of there being a swipe or two added to the DT, neither of which is ideal. So I went ahead, took the airbrush, and added another coat. At this point here, it's almost dry, but I think it's good enough for the installation. Oh, on the inside over here, we can see the mechanism for the pivoting device. Like I said, it's going to plug into this section over here. There's going to be a brass rod that emerges from this area, and this is going to connect to the servo. As for what the unit is, well, if anyone's the keen-eyed amongst you, you'll know this is one of my ECA American MP48 spring antenna-based tops. It was a scrap one I had on hand. It was a unit that could not have been used for manufacturing, so it was either let it languish away in the spare bin or put it to good use. So I went ahead, did some machining to it, and now it's going to be turned into a pivoting device. So there you go, recycling at its finest. All right, so I'm going to yank this guy out, and now I'm going to go ahead and secure the DT in its appropriate location. But even though you can see what it looks like in this section over here, and as you can see, it is just really, really detailed compared to the way we had it originally. And here we have the unit fully assembled, and at this point it's ready for installation. In addition to getting all of the detailing fitted in place, I also went ahead and hooked up the mechanical bits. As for what that looks like, let me go ahead, flip the thing over, and you'll get a better look. And here's the unit over here for all to see. So it's a very simple system, but it's one that works pretty well. You'll see that from the MP48, I have a brass rod that emerges from this section over here, and then this connects via a series of linkages to the servo star, which will of course be hooked up to the servo, and as you can see, the piece will pivot absolutely flawlessly. For this system, you'll notice that I went ahead and did something a bit differently compared to the other linkages and pivoting systems I've done in the past, where on this one here, I actually just took some brass strip and I use that for the actual linkages itself. On past builds, I usually just use rods, and I have either a ball and clevis type system or some kind of a other type of system that secures it to the servo star. And the reason why I went with this style of linkage as opposed to the others is because with this one here, it ensures that everything moves in a linear motion and there's no rotational pivot to it whatsoever. Or if there is any rotation, it's a slight one, but it's there on purpose, and you'll see why once the unit gets fitted in place. If you are rolling with a ball and socket type linkage, those do work actually remarkably well and are really easy to hook up. However, when you are hooking up one of those, with the way the ball and socket system is, it'll have a tendency of sometimes making the piece, instead of going side by side, it'll want to rotate because it would be the path of least resistance. And that's something that's less than ideal. However, on those systems, in order to thwart that, if anyone's seen my other videos, you'll know that I go ahead and have a slot that is machined or cut into a brass strip whatsoever. It's bolted to the armor, and that effectively acts as a guide and keeps everything square and on the straight and narrow. However, on this build over here, I'm not able to do that type of system because of the angle of the plate. There's no real easy way to get access to the inside to have the fasteners, unlike, say, a Tiger 1, which is a really easy system to go ahead and add that system to, as opposed to the T34, where it's less so. So rather than doing with that approach, by going with the flat bar method, this ensures that the piece is nice and straight, and there are no any possible way for the thing to actually pivot or yaw. And as for the linkages, well, everything is all hooked up with soldering. So I have the brass rod here. I soldered it to the brass strip. As you can see, it's quite a bit of length of the brass rod that was used for the soldering. I even bent the piece over here for more surface area, which made the solder stick better and gives it for a stronger bond. That's really the only soldering that was done. The other two sections that we have here were just brass strips, again, cut to the right length. Then I drilled out the sections here, and I used a M3 hex bolt for the hinging purposes. On this one here, you'll notice I use a little drop of solder on each of these as opposed to Loctite because of the pivoting nature. The problem with using a fastener is that after a while the piece will start loosening up and unscrewing on you, even if you use Loctite. However, if you solder the thing in place, obviously it's going to be a much more stronger bond and a much more permanent bond compared to using Loctite. On the servo star, you'll see how that's configured in place. I drilled out these two holes over here and mounted an M2.5 fastener. And two of these were used to secure the thing in place. You don't want to use one because with the torque that this thing is going to be under, you want to have 2 points of contact as opposed to one, because one will have the tendency on potentially pivoting on you, and that's something that's less than ideal. By going with a 2 fastener method, it locks the thing in place and ensures that all of the motion and force of the servo is being directed in a linear path that you desire. And here's the unit fitted to the model. The installation was rather anticlimactic because it went on without any sort of problems. The unit is held on with the use of adhesives, and I also have these weld sculpt over here that's going to add some extra strength. From what I've seen, the piece is held on extremely well to the point where fasteners are not necessary. The only way this thing is going to pop off is if it takes a good impact, say if, I don't know, someone's winging a hammer. And if that's the case, I think you got bigger problems to worry about than your model. But either way, this thing is mounted rock solid onto the model's hull. The mechanical system has also been hooked up, and the unit performs absolutely perfectly. So much so that I'll go ahead and show you right now. Currently, the model is powered on, and the system is patched into the circuitry. And if I go ahead and hit the radio, the animation clearly works very, very well. The way the animation is hooked up, and this is something that I do on all of my builds, is I piggyback it off of another function. And in this case here, it's piggybacked off of the turret rotation, so that when you're driving the tank and you hit the turret rotation to rotate the turret, you'll also have an added animation of the MG pivoting. You could do the same thing with the elevation. It just depends on your personal choice and preference. I am also going to have some other animations on some of the other periscopes on the turret that are going to be using the exact same type of system. So again, it's a way to get some extra animation and some extra functionality out of your build without the need of having an extra channel on your radio. with the camera off the tripod, you get a better look at the mechanical systems, or at least as much as I can with the current lighting situation. Like I said before, the T34 is very, very, very space conscious, shall we say, even in 1/6 scale. So here we have the servo mounted to the bracket that we have here. The bracket was for mounting other bits of equipment, so it's a perfect location to mount the servo. It's just held on with 2 fasteners. Hopefully you could see them right here on camera. The material itself was just drilled and tapped. Oop, that's the radio. Hang on. There we go. The material itself was just drilled and tapped, so the use of a nut is not necessary. You just go ahead and thread it in with a little bit of Loctite, and that thing isn't going to go anywhere. As for the linkage, you can see how it emerges from the servo star, right there, there, and to the MG, which is in this inner recess that we have right here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the tank back on, and we could go ahead, and you can see the system in actuation. Simple and very sweet. As you can see, the use of the flat bar, as I mentioned before, does a great job with preventing the thing from yawing or pivoting on you, which is exactly what you want for this type of an animation feature. It's also very cost effective to produce. It's nothing more than literally just K&S 1/4 inch brass strip. Moving back to the front section, you get to see the welds that were sculpted. This is done my usual 2-part epoxy. It's the same stuff that I've mentioned several times already on this video series, as well as also many of the other builds that are found on this channel in several scales. In addition to the welds being sculpted around this section over here, which, by the way, with the addition of the welds, the MG is literally complete. Nothing more needs to be done to this, construction-wise, except for masking this section up here, so when I paint the thing, it doesn't get oversprayed. Outside of that, the MG is officially done. So, the next thing to mention is, again, having to do with the welds, and that is carry on to what I was referencing in the previous video with the addition of the certain appendages that we have here. If we recall in the other video, I went ahead and added the step rail to this section, the grab handles, as well as also the grouger mounts to the hull. These are all fabricated out of metal wire for the grouger mounts, bar stock for the handles, and plastic for the foot loop, or the step rail. And as you can see, since the last video, I sculpted the welds. The welds were the last thing that need to be done to these areas here to complete the look. And once everything is dried and set, it does the job absolutely perfectly, marking another completion on this build. Pan the camera to the opposite side. The welds were added to these various locations as well. Okay, so with this out of the way, the next thing I'm going to do is to put the top deck back on, pop the rear deck back on, and focus on the blower. As for what that looks like, well, and here it is. At this point here, the blower has been fitted in place, the locking mechanism has been mounted as well, and the thing is fully completed. Let me go ahead and take the camera off the tripod so you get a better idea on what the installation looks like, as well as also some of the features that it does have. And here you can see the blower in better light. Probably the most interesting and bizarre aspect on the whole T34 family in this regard is with the blower, and again how the unit fits and is hinged in place. So to the casual observer out there, you'll look at this and be like, oh, there are the hinges right over there, the whole thing pivots backward. And like I may have mentioned earlier, that's just not the case. What you see here is misleading. These are not the hinges. These are actually the locks. You can see the lock pin right here on either side, and I'll take them off momentarily and you'll get to see the piece actually function. The hinges are actually right here along the top deck and are mounted to the underside here of the portions. And you'll see that once everything is hinged open. But before I do, I just want to mention, as you can see now, the entire rear end is fleshed out accordingly. One comment that I remember reading a number of videos ago was when I took this thing out for a test drive, it was before the entire rear end was mounted in place, so the plate was just what we see over here. And one of the commenters commented that the T34 looks good, but there's something wrong with the back. The shape looked wrong. And as I stated in the comment section, yes, you are absolutely correct. It's because it's missing the top rear deck. The rear deck really does change immensely the look of the vehicle, and it transforms it into a shape that is very different compared to what we see in its naked format. But this is what the T34 looks like, and as you can see, it fleshed out very, very nicely, and it looks more appropriate to what we think of when we think of the T34. So, to open up the hatch, first I'm going to do is pull out these pins. There's one. Here's the other, and by the way, this has got to be the most Russian of Russian engineering I have ever seen. And trying to reverse engineer this thing, oh yeah, you definitely could see that something like this is not exactly the type of fitting or the type of design feature that we'll see on any other type of vehicle, except something from the Soviets. So it's definitely, the memes do come true. Anyway, so you pull the pins out on either side, and then from here, the entire unit just hinges right upward like this. So here go the hinges that I mentioned before. They are connected to the various bits of equipment that we have here on the rear deck. And the hinges, like I stated again, are a floating style hinge. So we just have a bent piece of wire, and that acts as the hinge. And the piece just floats like this, the way you see it here. As for securing the hinges in place, I used both adhesives, but I also had to use some fasteners because trying to get the thing to hold on in place while fighting the torque of the hinges was definitely something better done with a fastener, and it makes for a stronger mount in that regard. The piece does have this little wiggle to it. Again, as per the real unit, I was looking at lots of pictures of these real ones that still have the original piece in place, and this thing is banged up, dinged up. It's never straight. Again, you want T34? That's T34. So what we have here is true to form to the real one in almost all respects. So as for securing in place, like I said before, it's glued, where I have to drill a hole into the piece here. The piece plugs in, but I also went ahead and used a fastener on these sections over here to, again, hold everything in place. And the fastener does a good job, and with the dome-headed fastener here, it does replicate the look of the just the dome-headed rivets that are found on the piece. And for the intended purpose of this on the interior here, it should be just fine. To close the unit, it just closes right back down into this little section over here. Find this little sweet spot, and then from there, we can go ahead and pin the units back together. Just like so. Just wiggle it in place, and you're good to go. That's one. And let's see, where did I do with the other pin? Here it is. These things are very easily lost. Fortunately, they're really easily made. Not more than a bent piece of floor wire. Alright, so pins fitted. The thing is now retained in place. It's not going to go anywhere, even when the tank is in operation. It's not going to flop around, and it works exactly as per the real unit. So with the blower in place, obviously this is a big chunk of the build now in the rearview mirror, and the last thing needs to be added to the rear section here is just the addition of the exhaust manifolds with their armored covers. I do have those parts, as I mentioned them in the other video, and just with the way I'm filming and editing things together, these are definitely going to be discussed in the next video update. Which, on that note, this thing is actually rocket sledding to the finish line. It may not seem like it, but believe it or not, behind the scenes, I am very in the weeds at work, researching and developing a bunch of new parts for it. In fact, at the time I'm filming this, I have either in production or actually they're done and waiting to be shipped, a number of components that are going to flesh out the last of the hull detail fittings. This would include things, and I'll even throw samples up on camera right now, the headlight, the siren, the large toolbox, the other pattern large toolbox, the small toolbox, and even the saw. In addition to that, also on the front end section over here, the last thing needs to be fitted in place is the bow driver's hatch, which, by the way, at the time of filming this, those files are basically finished. Again, you can see it for yourself. This is how I spend my 2 a.m., guys. And that, with those files basically done then, the thing's going to slide off into production. Once I have those in hand, that's going to be fitted in place. After the bow hatch is done, we are on the cupola. I already started the cupola earlier on. I stepped away from it because I needed to check some dimensions and stuff. But once the cupola is done, this guy here is going to be the next area of focus, and I'm going to concentrate on it until it's finished. Once those files are done, and those last detail fittings are added in place, This tank is ready for painting. That's right, it's done. Ready for painting, which means it will be shortly completed thereafter. And after a build this long and also this, frankly, well detailed, well, it's definitely going to be one that is, I think, going to be a well-liked addition on the ECA channel. Not to mention the customer, he's definitely going to want to get it. But other than that, this one here, as you can see, is definitely making its progress, and once it's finished, of course, you guys will all be the first to know, and I will gladly post videos of the journey. And that's basically all that we stand today on this project update video on the 1/6 scale Armortek Russian T34 85 medium tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being 1/6 scale project update videos like this one over here, or the other smaller scale model showcase videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have more photographs of this particular build that have been posted since the project start, as well as also photographs of the other small and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel previously. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.